We're living our truth now. Crystal, what?
Krista who?
Christadelphian?
Did you say Christian Dolphin? So are you from Philadelphia?
Welcome to the Life After Leaving podcast, an ex-Christadelphian podcast. Hello. Today I just want to add a quick trigger warning for Christadelphians. As I always point out, this podcast was developed for ex-Christadelphians by ex-Christadelphians, and I'm just repeating that again here because I think this could be a triggering episode for any listeners who are still active members of the Christadelphian community. It could cause some distress, some cognitive dissonance, but for everyone else, I think we're going to have a lot of fun, and this is something really relevant to unpack after leaving. So let's get into it. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Life After Leaving podcast. I'm your host, Zinnia. Today's history is all about prophecy, or as the aliens in Toy Story would say in Wonder, the prophecy. This is going to be an important episode because for those of us who grew up Christadelphians, prophecy is something we regularly heard about at meeting. Prophecy was presented as a reason to believe in Christadelphian teachings, and Rob mentioned that in episode 3, as it's considered both important to believe in prophecy and considered to be good evidence for their beliefs in the Bible. So what is Christadelphian prophecy? The context to know for this episode is that it's essentially a reference to the belief that we are in the final days of human-ruled society and that we are living through global catastrophes referred to as the, quote, signs of the times, unquote. There are individual predictions that we will get into, but I'll use the term somewhat broadly because I believe it includes the perspective and belief that we are currently witnessing the fulfillment of prophecy in the Bible, mostly from the books of Daniel and Revelation, and it's more of a lens through which events are interpreted, which are then said to signal that Jesus is going to return to earth. Christadelphian beliefs culminate in the idea that Jesus still exists and is hanging out with God right now somewhere, watching terrible things happen on earth. But he will come back, wage war and spend 1,000 years transforming the world, which they call the millennium, so that God can come back to earth and hang out with humans again, just like he did with Adam and Eve before they were sinners. But I guess the couch that Jesus is hanging out on in heaven is just really comfy because his return just keeps getting postponed. And I don't think people realize by quite how much. So we're going to get into that today. As you know, I'm a heathen who does not believe in Christadelphian teachings, but I was raised to believe in this. So I want to explore the history of this topic from that perspective without the bias of someone who still believes in it. I think this topic is especially relevant for ex-Christadelphians because it often drives a huge wedge between Christadelphians and ex-Christadelphians. Christadelphians want to save ex-Christadelphians from their murderous God, and so they reach out to those people who have stopped attending to remind them of the prophecy, to share with them events that they've interpreted as related to the end times, and to warn us of our imminent deaths for not listening to them, which sound vaguely or overtly threatening. So it's one of the most uncomfortable and frequent topics that comes up for people after leaving the group, because it's what's dangled at the end of the line that they want to reel us back in with. And also, as an ex-Christadelphian myself, this is something that I have to come to terms with, because if Christadelphians are right and their prophecy of the end times is true, then that would be really bad for me, a heathen and an unrepentant sinner. However, one perspective that is never shared is what if they are the ones who are wrong? After all, there are also consequences if they are wrong, which they never talk about. But I do want to mention that today because I know I'm tired of always hearing just one side of this story. So in my usual style, let's look at the history of Christadelphian Bible prophecy to get a better understanding of this topic, where it came from, and to find out what the truth of the matter is. Because after all, don't we love the truth? All right, so today I actually want to start with a story about a guy named William Miller. Miller was not a Christadelphian, but he was a contemporary of Dr. John Thomas in the United States. the most important thing you need to know about William Miller is that he believed he had learned when the second coming of Christ would be. He was so excited after reading his Bible and doing some algebra to figure out a date that he began publishing in magazines and giving lectures, which resulted in a following of people believing in his prediction, and they were then called Millerites. Very original name, obviously. They could have been the Millerdelphians, but they just didn't think of it. So William Miller originally predicted that Christ was going to return between March 1843 and March of 1844. So sometime in those 12 months, Jesus would come back. The unfortunate thing about this prediction, which you probably saw coming, was that it didn't come true. However, Miller realized he had made a small mistake. So he's like, okay, my bad. And the second time he made his prediction, Miller was more exact and claimed to know the exact day that Jesus was going to return this time. So the real date of Jesus' return to Earth was October 22nd, 1844, just a few months after his original end date of March 1844. So Miller published the new date after the Millerites kept asking when the real date of Jesus' return was, since they were so excited about it. And once the new prediction was made, the people were hyped. As the end of October drew closer, people were selling their homes and possessions, and on October 22nd, 1844, some Millerites dressed in their finest rapture clothing, which, for those of you who don't know what your finest rapture clothing should be, were white robes, and many of them spent the day waiting in their churches or on hilltops, prepared and waiting for Jesus. And you might see where this story is going again. As midnight passed and the day ended, the members collectively had a complete mental breakdown when they realized that Jesus hadn't come. They were absolutely heartbroken and let down. People just cried uncontrollably and could not be consoled. This day actually went down in history as the Great Disappointment, which is how I would also describe most first dates I've ever been on. So this was a make or break moment for the group. The Millerites had to decide what they were going to do now that Jesus hadn't come. After all, there was no gray area here. They had plainly been told when Jesus was coming, and he hadn't shown twice. In the end, the followers of William Miller basically went in three directions after the Great Disappointment. The first group of people left. They were embarrassed, they'd been hoodwinked, but they learned from it, they moved on with their lives, and eventually I'm sure they thought it was just a funny story they could tell their grandkids about. They moved on. The second group of people left for other religious groups. Some Millerites became Shakers or Quakers, some returned to Baptists, Methodists, the Presbyterians that they may have been originally members of. They were still ready to devote their lives to God in just a different religious group that appealed to them. All right. So the third group of people just decided to keep believing anyways. I mean, they already bought the white robes, so they're in it to win it. And they did not admit defeat. And this primarily includes people who then went on to form the group that is currently known as the Seventh-day Adventists, who, according to Google, still believe that Christ will return a second coming, and who apparently decide that the date October 22nd, 1844, had actually been the correct date after all. So the reactions of the first two groups seems pretty logical. They were more informed, decided to take a step back, and not risk that public humiliation and financial catastrophe that many of them may have experienced while they were Millerites. They learned something and made a decision to separate themselves from that group based on seeing the evidence that the predictions made by the group were untrue. And meanwhile, the reaction of that third group to double down probably seems counterintuitive to most people. This third group basically decided to keep believing something in spite of the evidence that had been presented that it was not true. And I really mean the evidence was pretty clear. They were told he was coming back October 22nd, and October 23rd rolled around without Jesus being back. So as I mentioned, it was just really cut and dry that he didn't come back. And since he hadn't, then that would mean that William Miller had never truly known the date that Jesus was returning. So why on earth would anyone believe William Miller a third time? And how would you even begin to trust him again after he bungled something up so badly that it literally went down in history as the Great Disappointment? What happened was those people in that third group basically created justifications that explained away the disappointment. According to one Adventist website that discusses the Great Disappointment, some people just decided to believe that Jesus had come, but secretly. Now, this seems like an even more disappointing belief, because then they're choosing to believe that Jesus came back to Earth after almost 1900 years at that point, looked at these crowds of people waiting for him, wearing white robes. They're probably singing hymns and praying. And Jesus just went, nah, and just completely ghosted them. Like, some of them apparently believed that the date was correct, but maybe the event was wrong, so they didn't witness like the big thing. But God was doing something that day, you know? And some of them came up with new calculations, and those ranged from 1854 to 1874. I guess they just really loved years with fours on them. I don't know why. And some people also said, oh, it's not a literal return to Earth. The prophecy meant something figurative. So they kept reading their Bibles and trying to come up with a plausible explanation for why Jesus hadn't returned, to avoid having to sit with the fact that they had been proven wrong in their beliefs. There's also a term for this type of thinking, in which someone is presented with evidence that challenges their beliefs, and instead of accepting the evidence and using it to change their behavior, instead they change their thinking so that they can keep believing what they want to believe. This term is called cognitive dissonance. It's a psychological term. I swear to God, if this is true, it was identified and named by psychologists studying a doomsday cult that believed in aliens in the 1950s. So let me just pause to tell you about that real quick. The term was coined by a guy named Leon Festinger in the 1950s after studying a religion called the Seekers, who believed aliens were communicating with them telepathically to tell them that the apocalypse was imminent. A housewife told the newspapers that an alien from planet Clarion, yes, Clarion like the hotel chain, telepathically warned her that there was going to be a catastrophic earthquake followed by a devastating flood on December 21st, 1954. Again, every good doomsday prediction year ends with a 4. I don't know why. We just missed 2024. That should have been a really good doomsday prediction year. This is also incredible to me, because there are still some parts of the country where you can't even get good cell reception, and yet she can receive telepathic messages from another galaxy pinged directly to her head. Like, excuse me, but I want phone service as good as her telepathic specificity. Like, how did the aliens never miss and like send a telepathic message to her neighbors? That would be some incredible technology if that was true. Like, that's some Jetsons futuristic shit. And I also love that people had enough of a sense of humor around this to be like, yeah, let's make this headline news. So some psychologists heard about it from the papers and were like, you know what, let's get in on this. This scenario resembles the Great Disappointment closely enough that we can study their behavior and thinking to learn what causes some people to leave, some to pivot, and some to keep believing when it doesn't happen. And again, it was similar to the extent that some people believed it enough to like leave their jobs, stop going to school, end their relationships, probably with those heathen partners who didn't believe in aliens. And they even gave away possessions to prepare to leave Earth on a UFO in December 1954. So in the end, again, the predicted flood on December 21st didn't happen. And just like with the Millerites, they quickly came up with a new date that also wasn't too far away. And so the new date was December 24th. Again, they must have been 1 4 short in the date. You just needed 1 more 4. So they changed the date from the 21st to the 24th and waited. And once again, the UFOs didn't come. But fortunately for them, neither did earthquakes or floods either. So basically, nothing happened. So the researchers watched as the group split, again, kind of according to those responses. And this was to this more... So the researchers watched as the group split according to their responses to this more recent disappointment. And again, if you're thinking logically, then you would probably guess that once people saw the evidence that something was untrue, then they would probably believe that and no longer believe in the original hypothesis. And yes, some of the group members left completely, but there were still members who continued to believe despite the evidence that they were wrong, and those people doubled down. What the researchers found was that these people became more committed to their beliefs, and they were seeking out more publicity. They tried to convert people to their group more aggressively after they rationalized that the lack of apocalyptic floods and alien spaceships by saying that their faith had saved the world from this disaster. See? So the psychologists studied them and named this phenomenon that they witnessed of like rationalizing and distorting it cognitive dissonance. And so that described how people are presented with something that challenges their beliefs and it makes them uncomfortable. And they change their thinking so that the challenge goes away and they don't feel so uncomfortable. So we basically have aliens to thank for this term, which is a great backstory. So now in the present day, we have this theory of cognitive dissonance to help understand why some people continue to believe in things that have been proven to not be true. All right, so you may be thinking, oh, Zinnia is talking about the Millerites because their focus on prophecy makes them similar to Christadelphians. She's using this group as an example for talking about people deluding themselves into believing apocalyptic prophecies. Oh, no. Some early Christadelphians were Millerites. And not only that, but John Thomas kind of was too, which I want to tell you about. And if you're a Christadelphian who ignored my warning at the beginning of this episode and is listening to this anyways, you might be thinking, I'm sure that's not the case that Miller had anything to do with the origins of the Christadelphians. John Thomas figured the truth out for himself. John Thomas was just simply teaching these poor Millerites the truth. That couldn't have anything to do with us as Christadelphians. Well, tell Christadelphian author Peter Hemingway that, because a picture of William Miller is literally on the cover of his book, John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith. Like, if you don't know what William Miller looks like, go to his Wikipedia page, then Google Hemingway's book, and you'll recognize the photo from his Wikipedia page as the same one that's on the bottom left-hand side of that book cover. And for our COGAF friends, one of the prominent leaders of COGAF, Joseph Marsh, was also a Millerite, according to page 154 of Hemingway's book. So there's a Christadelphian history fun fact for you. And to be clear, a lot of people became Christadelphians after leaving religions like the Baptists and the Campbellites. But coincidentally, John Thomas had his falling out with the Campbellites starting around 1843 and began to struggle to get audiences for his message right around the time that many Millerites had lost their belief in their religious leader. So John Thomas tried to step in. He also lived with people associated with the Millerites in 1843 and 1844 as well. So he was immersed in that theology, which is not coincidental to the evolution of the Christadelphian faith. On page 140 of John Thomas, His Friends and His Faith by Peter Hemingway, he writes of John Thomas that, quote, his access to Campbellite congregations was largely eliminated, and Dr. Thomas was forced to spread his message more widely by preaching to other groups, including Adventists in New Jersey and Millerites in upstate New York, unquote. And on page 146, quote, fewer and fewer Campbellite churches would let him preach. This essentially forced him to appeal to the remaining Millerite congregations, who were left leaderless by the great disappointment of 1844, unquote. I guess that means if one of your ancestors converted from Millerism to the Christadelphians and another prophecy doesn't come true, then it's now a great disappointment. See what I did there? And yes, eventually we'll also discuss that bit about the Campbellites not letting him preach at some point, but that's a story for another episode. For today, we're going to take a look at the fact that he basically rebranded himself as a Millerite preacher right at the height of notoriety for the Millerites. So to continue with our main thread here, John Thomas preaching to Millerites and a denomination closely associated with the Millerites, the Adventists, was a match made in heaven. Or maybe on earth, as the case may be, as they were waiting for the end of the world, and he was more than happy to preach the end of the world to them. So how did this happen that John Thomas was suddenly preaching to the Millerites? Like, did John Thomas discover the date of the return of Jesus through reading his Bible like Miller was claiming to? No, of course not. Come on. Yet again, John Thomas did not discover anything himself, and even less from reading his Bible. As we know, John Thomas was very much a part of the religious scene of the day, and so he was naturally influenced by this religious craze sweeping through the eastern United States at the time around biblical prophecy, and he was reading extensively. I mean, he was also a religious preacher during that time, and I'm sure he needed to have his own perspective on it when people would ask him what he thought about the predictions. So it's not truly coincidental that John Thomas's interest veered sharply into prophecy at this time. I actually checked his biography to see if Bible prophecy came up in earlier chapters, and it honestly doesn't appear until William Miller is mentioned. So based on the sequence of events, it does appear that his interest in Bible prophecy literally started with the Millerite predictions of the end of the world that led up to the Great Disappointment. Peter Hemingway and Robert Roberts both record that Thomas started reading Millerite publications at that time as well. Peter Hemingway shares with us in John Thomas's Friends in His Faith that, quote, Dr. Thomas further studied the writings of Miller, unquote. And this is not a surprise to literally anybody at this point, because we have already gone over the fact that John Thomas was reading tons of religious works besides the Bible, and we've talked about that in previous history episodes, so of course he wanted to read Miller's writings. He was reading everything. Meanwhile, Robert Roberts actually records John Thomas's sudden interest in biblical prophecy in his biography of John Thomas, called Dr. Thomas, His Life and His Works. After Dr. Thomas left the medical school in St. Charles, Illinois, which I mentioned in the true crime episode where people got shot for digging up corpses, after that, he left his wife and daughter in Cincinnati, Ohio, while he decided to travel around the United States and eventually just live in Louisville, Kentucky for a year at his friend's house. So Roberts wrote that he was staying with a friend who was a Campbellite, quote, of Millerite tendencies, unquote. And because these guys were living together, as bros do, I guess, that prompted Dr. Thomas to begin reading Millerite publications, since his friends subscribed to Millerite publications that he would share with him. Roberts also records that Miller had a system of chronology that was the basis of the prophetical calculations. It also records that, quote, Mr. Miller was willing to stake the accuracy of his calculations on the conclusion that the world was 6,000 years old in 1843, unquote. So if you don't believe that the world was 6,000 years old in 1843, then I guess you don't have to worry about the end times, because that's what all Bible prophecy is based off of, apparently. So that's good news. But the reason Dr. Thomas was reading Miller's prophetic interpretations was because Dr. Thomas basically wanted to one-up William Miller. According to Robert Roberts in his biography of John Thomas, quote, it occurred to the doctor to take advantage. He thought if he were able to show that the world is younger than Mr. Miller's theory presumed, it would be on Mr. Miller's own admission a complete refutation of his prophetic arithmetic. And the doctor accordingly set to work and wrote an article upon the world's age, in which he showed several important mistakes had been made by Miller. About the same time, he wrote a letter to the editor of a leading Millerite paper, unquote. Also, prophetic arithmetic might be a good band name. But then, not only did Dr. Thomas decide that Miller was wrong, had made mistakes in his calculations, but John Thomas basically also said, hold my beer, and began making his own prophetic interpretations, using his revisions to Miller's prophecies as his foundation. John Thomas wrote a letter to the editor of The Western Midnight Cry of Louisville, Kentucky on February 13th, 1844, and lucky for us, Robert Roberts recorded it in his biography of John Thomas. Thomas wrote, quote, though I differ with Mr. Miller in some of his conclusions, I sympathize with him. I believe he is both candid and honest. He deserves much credit for having aroused the attention of so many of this truly infidel generation of religionists to the study of the holy prophets. I have read both sides to a sufficient extent to be enabled to judge without prejudice, and I am perfectly satisfied that his main arguments are untouched by his opponents. No man who has any regard for his reputation for rationality and intelligence ought to deny that the 70 weeks are a part of the vision of 2,300 days. This can be proved without a doubt, and therefore the 2,300 days must end in 1843, though it can be by no means proved that, because they end in that year, the world will therefore come to an end with them. I contend, therefore, that the 391 years and 30 days should be calculated from May 29th A.D. 1453, which will cause them to end June 29th, 1844. The time is near, so that you will soon be able to verify or confute this calculation by the facts in the case, unquote. So the original Millerite date would have ended in March 1844. So the main difference here was that Dr. Thomas estimated that Miller was a few months off. And he doesn't really claim that the world will end on that date, but Thomas doesn't actually say what is supposed to happen on June 29th, 1844. So it seems to be implying that that is the date Miller should have calculated as being the end of the world date. What else would it signify? So Dr. Thomas continues by writing, quote, "We therefore concluded to await the arrival of the Ides of March 1844 as an epoch which, in the disappointment of their expectations, would do more to open their eyes than the most labored argument we could elaborate against their hypothesis. We were glad to see them take so much interest in the second coming of Christ, in the belief of whose near approach we fully coincide with them. It is well to believe in the approaching manifestation of Messiah, but it is better to believe that and to be prepared for him too." Unquote. So it sounds like he was already plotting to undermine the Millerites' belief in Miller and was trying to gain influence over Miller's followers. And John Thomas was correct. The world didn't end in March 1844, so Miller was wrong. However, the world also didn't end in June of 1844, so Thomas was also wrong. And so begins the failed prophecies of John Thomas and the Christadelphians. And yes, this is the oldest Christadelphian Bible prophecy I have found. And yes, it begins with failure. It is not a great start. And it's worth noting that John Thomas was not discouraged by that in the least. In fact, John Thomas eventually began to believe that he was sent by God to preach the apocalypse to his followers. Robert Roberts records this in his biography, My Days and My Ways, when he details this conversation with Dr. Thomas when the doctor was discussing the publication of his book, Eureka, an exposition of the apocalypse. Quote, "So you see," said the doctor, "when the divine inventor and the proprietor of the apocalypse requires its exposition, he has the means at hand. The heaven-sent document is his. He sent it for a purpose, no mean element in which is the warning of his servants of the generation concurrent with his appearing and his kingdom." Unquote. I mean, there are a few things here to point out. First, the implication that the book he wrote on the apocalypse is heaven-sent, and that he is the tool God used to deliver his message to his servants. That feels pretty indicative of the size of his ego. It's also funny that this exchange was cut from Robert's biography by Islip Collier when he was editing it and revising it to make his official biography. And it's always interesting to me how many things were quickly hidden away that Roberts and Thomas had said and done, over time. There's a lot of censorship if you go back to the old original writings and compare it to the later ones. Like that story of Roberts having doubts in John Thomas and wanting to turn away in disgust, which I mentioned in the Robert Roberts episode. Oh, that was also cut from his biography, but was in his autobiography that had been the original work. And John Thomas says right there that this book, written in 1861, was written for the generation that would witness his appearing in his kingdom, talking about the return of Jesus. That was it. That was the generation that was supposed to see it. So please let me know how your relatives who are about 200 years old are doing, because all my relatives from that time period have strangely passed away without that coming true. So June of 1844 was the earliest recorded end times prophecy by a Christadelphian that I am aware of. But it's not the last. Next, I want to share documentation of the many other historical failed prophecies they don't want you to know about and never really talk about. So the next prediction John Thomas made was the year 1848. In fact, this date was actually in the original Elpis Israel preface. And in the later editions, the publishers made sure to let us know that he made false prophecies before. But that won't be a problem anymore. The updated preface records, quote, "The year 1848, great excitement was produced in the United States by the news of what was going on in Europe. Many who had for years before been predicting the end of all things were now persuaded that it had come at last. But his satisfaction at the news was also on account of the proof it afforded him that he had found the prophetic key. He had for several years previous to 1848 been calling the attention of the people to the signs of the times, which indicated the approach of the kingdom of heaven." Unquote. And yeah, this checks out. John Thomas moved on from his original date of 1844, and after that date passed, he became fixated on 1848. But it turns out that John Thomas had not found the prophetic key, which he thought he had, which they mention. And this was admitted in later editions of Elpis Israel. In another edition, the publishers wrote about how heartened and spiritually stimulated John Thomas was. And that, quote, "In that most amazing year, 1848, present-day readers should prudently appreciate that we are living in similar times, thus more evidently heralding the nearness of Christ's return. Unquote. Right. It's so easy to get that amazing years confused with all his other non-amazing years when Jesus didn't return. I mean, it was 4 years after 1844, so I'm surprised that Jesus didn't come back, because he loves years with fours in them. That's what I'm getting from this. But those comments were actually written in 2000, so it's already been another 25 years since we got that reminder that we're living in the final days, and they're just as exciting as 1848. And I love that the publishers were trying so hard to be supportive of John Thomas because, he's the founder, he's the original leader. So they're like, yeah, we love 1848. Oh, it was a great year. Yep, absolutely. But at some point, you should admit that he just kept going up to bat with prophecy and he kept striking out. But instead, they're just praising his predictions despite them being wrong. And then reiterating, that the end times are actually just whatever time you're reading this. So the goalpost keeps moving. Basically, welcome to the religion where everything's made up and the facts don't matter. The next Christadelphian prophecy was 1866 to 1868. This is the first one I'm seeing that had a 2-year span in which the prophecy could be fulfilled. So they brought in some wiggle room. By this point, Robert Roberts was deeply involved in the community, so there was a lot of hype recorded for these dates because he was pushing it in his magazine. So our next quote is from the January 1866 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, which again was originally named the Ambassador of the Coming Age. And let's just take a second to remember that since the start of the Christadelphian magazine, they were focused on this coming age in the future, this new period of time after the prophecy was fulfilled and Jesus is ruling the earth. This prophecy and belief in Jesus' return quickly became central to their belief system after Thomas had fully bought into Miller's methods of interpreting the Bible to create prophecies starting in the 1840s. After that, prophecy and this fixation on the future really became a key component since those foundational years of the group when all of the dogma was originally established. If Miller or other people with similar ideas had never come on the scene, I don't know if this would have become part of their teachings and culture. And it's interesting how even after Miller and Thomas were both wrong in their predictions for the return of Christ, they just decided to keep creating prophecies and insist that this new age is coming any day. This feels like it should have been bigger news than it was. But anyways, back to January 1866, edition of the Christadelphian magazine. The first article, so basically the cover story, was entitled Address to Our Readers on Entering 1866 to 1868. Roberts was using the magazine to give everyone notice that Jesus is coming in the next 2 years. You had better be ready. You have no excuse to not be ready. Front page news. You saw it. So in the article, Roberts writes, quote, God has made his servants privy to his counsels. He has answered the question, how long? And we are enabled to gauge our position with a result which makes our entry upon this year 1866 an event calculated to rouse every slumbering virgin. We emphasize upon the fact which we repeat, that the minds directed to the study of prophecy for the last 200 years and more have with something like unanimity fixed upon 1866 to 68 as the terminal date of the periods by which times and seasons are measured in prophecy. Possibly and probably the culmination may come before 1866 to 68 passes away. In any case, it is pretty certain that Jesus will return within the lifetime of the present generation. Unquote. So once again, the founding Christadelphians were certain that Jesus was coming back, and it was going to be sometime between 1866 and 1868. Got it? This was when John Thomas was really deep into prophecy too, because that was when he was publishing his series of volumes of Eureka in the 1860s, which were all about the book of Revelation and the apocalypse. And it's also kind of funny that in this quote, they also kind of a little backup statement there where basically, even if they're wrong about the exact years, it's pretty certain that it'll happen within the lifetime of the people who are reading that in the 1860s. So maybe they weren't as confident this time. I don't know. This prediction was widely shared, though. So besides frequent mentions in the magazine, it was also recorded in one of John Thomas's books, apparently. According to one website that I'll link in the show notes, this prediction was also mentioned in John Thomas's book, Anatolia. But I don't have a copy, so you can check your parents' Christadelphian books and see for yourself on that one. But essentially, John Thomas and Robert Roberts were in agreement on this date. They had checked their calculations again, and this time, The third time, they were sure they had it right. And I assume it's kind of like how Santa makes a list and checks it twice, but with John Thomas as Santa, and everyone's getting a King James Bible for Christmas, and also Cole, because you are all sinners. And even though Roberts was in a high-level role within the community, I still feel a little bad for Robert Roberts, because he was so influenced by John Thomas to give up his life to support his religion, and he truly believed that Jesus was about to return to earth. He was ready to go any day. And so you feel bad when he writes that he didn't plan on having to run the magazine that long. He was originally thinking that he would basically run the magazine to help contribute to the cause until Jesus comes, at which time the magazine would be irrelevant and he basically gets to enjoy retirement in the kingdom of God. It was unfortunately a very unrealistic retirement plan, and if you read enough of Robert Roberts' writings, you'll see these little comments pop up periodically where he'll throw in a comment about not expecting to have to wait this long. In the October 1893 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, they wrote that, quote, it, referring to the magazine, was started with the ominous date of 1866 to 8 looming just 3 years ahead, and therefore with the idea that the magazine could not have long to run, unquote. So Roberts was like almost tricked into running this magazine because he thought this was like a 3 to 5 year commitment, but it ended up being the rest of his life basically until he passed on the editor position to someone else and moved to Australia. And even John Thomas spoke like this, as though Jesus was coming any day. At the end of 1851, he wrote in his magazine, The Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come, which once again has a telling name when it says the age to come right in there, that, quote, such is the report with which we conclude our editorial labors for 1851. Next year, the world will be on fire, and in the midst of the blazing elements, we should regret having no medium of thought with the faithful, through which to stir up their pure minds by ways of remembrance, respecting the things coming speedily upon the nations. We shall therefore venture, if spared, to continue the Herald through 1852, unquote. Ah, yes, the prophecy is unfolding so speedily in the 1850s. And honestly, I can only imagine what it was like to be alive during that time and like get this in your mailbox. Like the hottest religions of the time involved talking to ghosts or waiting for the world to end. Like the Victorians had no chill at all. There was just so much drama, and John Thomas was living for this drama. I mean, nowadays they would just say, Lord willing, we'll continue our work for next year. But John Thomas is like, the world will literally be on fire, and I will be on the front lines to bring you this newspaper if God doesn't kill me with his bare hands first. It's just so dramatic. But I don't feel bad for John Thomas since he created this religion. He started this fixation on prophecy within the group. He actually also had retirement plans to move back to England and turn everything over to Robert Roberts. So I don't think he was as naive as Robert Roberts. And while Thomas was influenced by others, he wasn't subject to them the way his followers were to him. So I still feel bad for Robert Roberts, who got swept up in this Victorian apocalyptic religious fervor. And I also feel bad that like people are still maintaining these beliefs. I mean, they just said he was going to return during the lifetime of the current generation. And that was like 4 or 5 generations ago. And there are people still waiting today. But I actually didn't read the full quote earlier, so let me continue to read that passage from the same edition of the Christadelphian magazine from 1893. Quote, they are now again looking forward to a similar distance of time for the probable culmination of their hopes, and 1896 to 8 as the end of the 1290. That they will be disappointed this time is exceedingly unlikely, though barely possible, unquote. Oh man, it's honestly shocking how much irony there is in just that one quote. Like, they admit right there that they were wrong with their bold predictions in 1866, and then set themselves up again in the exact same situation and publish it in the same magazine with the same estimated wait period and are expecting different results. You know how people love that quote about how insanity is just doing the same thing and expecting different results? This is one of those situations where the lesson was there to learn from, and instead history repeated itself. And there's also more to this prophecy. In the September 1892 edition of the Christadelphian magazine, they hard launched this date that we just mentioned of 1896 to 98. But in that edition of the magazine, they also wrote, quote, "My faith is very strong that 1896 to 8 will see Daniel and his class arise to stand in their lot, and that 1941 to 3 will see the kingdom fully established and the saints resting from their labors. In truth, outside of that interpretation, it is all darkness and mere speculation to me. It is the only solid ground I see on which to stand. And I do not think the Lord has disregarded the earnest prayers of his children in a matter where he has promised light at the proper time." Unquote. Oh, this is just an existential crisis for Roberts now. And it almost sounds like a challenge to God. Like, if Jesus does not start resurrecting Daniel and other Bible characters in 1896 to 98, then God has ignored me personally. Like, do you really think that your prayers are working? You're basically acting like God is your elected official, and you're calling his office to leave feedback that he's not performing in the way that you expected he would. And clearly Robert Roberts is tired from running this magazine because he's like, my life is darkness, and I plan to be a saint, resting from my labor in a few years. I'm so tired of being the editor. Please, God, let Jesus come soon. If thy will be done, but also feel free to change your plan so we can set up the kingdom on a tropical beach, because this is also my retirement plan. Thank you. Amen. So we're already up to 4 failed predictions: 1844, 1848, 1866 to 68, and now 1896 to 98. And at no point yet has a prominent Christadelphian been like, hey, this doesn't seem to be working. Let's maybe stop picking random dates by adding a biblical number of days to the date of a historical event that occurred in the past. Nope. The cognitive dissonance kicks in and tells them to believe in the prophecy more and just be more prepared for the day that Jesus comes. So now they're blindly jumping from one failed prediction to the next. And my guess is that there's probably a part of them that kind of believes in the sunk cost fallacy too, which is basically when they've already put so much time and effort into something that they're just going to keep waiting because they feel like they would lose more by walking away. But there's a reason it's called the sunk cost fallacy. It's actually untrue. It's always worth it to walk away from something that's not right for you and not benefiting you. I mean, just think about it. If you have a gambling addiction, it's better to stop gambling than to keep gambling, trying to win it back, after you've already lost, right? I mean, if a Christadelphian like Robert Roberts had walked away after the first failed prophecy, or even the second one, or the third one, or the fourth one, if he had walked away, then he could have lived the rest of his life guided by his own decision-making, his own values, rather than basically living in a bubble where everything is filtered through this warped lens of, what does John Thomas believe about this? What does John Thomas think I should do? How much longer does John Thomas think we need to wait? I mean, after Robert Roberts decided to believe what John Thomas believed, that then drove how he chose his wife, how he spent his free time, how he interacted with other people, how he planned the rest of his life, and potentially his retirement years, how he spent his money, his time, everything. His choice to become a believer and eventually a Christadelphian once the name was adopted truly defined his life, and yet he never got the reward he had been promised. I just always find Robert Roberts to be a sad figure because he was duped so young and literally died without anything he believed coming true. He really honestly believed it, I'm sure of it, and he really wanted it to be true. And that's fine, you can believe whatever you want, but currently 0 Christadelphians have been saved, technically. 0 have received a reward. 0 have evidence that their faith is actually the correct faith. And if it wasn't true, which seems to be the case just given the number of failed prophecies we've seen already in this episode, then Robert Roberts basically sacrificed his entire life for a lie. And yes, technically he was an adult. He could have left just like any of us. But mentally he just couldn't find a way out even when he had that doubt. And that's part of why education and conversations like we have on the podcast are so valuable, in my opinion, because just living your life believing something that's already been proven to be wrong for hundreds of years, waiting to see if maybe they'll be right someday, while living in a high control environment does not seem like the most meaningful life someone could live, in my opinion. And even the possibility that I could be wrong is something that's never really mentioned when you're in the group. The focus is about the hope of eternal life. But on the flip side, the risk of being wrong in that hope is the risk of wasting your entire life waiting for something that may never happen. For me, there's not enough evidence for that faith to justify belief, and we're going to keep exploring that in this episode. One thing that kept coming to mind while I was writing this episode is the play Waiting for Godot. I read it at university, and basically nothing happens in the play except these two guys are waiting around for Godot. We don't know who Godot is, and the circumstances are changing and confusing throughout the play. And I was still a Christadelphian when I read it, and something about it resonated with me. Thinking about it now, it feels like such a parallel to the never-ending waiting for Jesus and of people just waiting for their entire lives. And no, we're not done with running through their prophecies. Those early prophecies were quite confident, so it was pretty easy to find material on them because they were literally putting these prophecies on the front page of the magazine. But there have probably been countless others, so I poked around to find others that were documented in Christadelphian writings. I actually came across this next one when I found an old website by a guy named John Hutchinson, who made a website debunking Christadelphian prophecies. So I guess he was an ex-Christadelphian, most likely. While searching for the website again, it was also clear the Christadelphians did not like that. But his website lives on, despite attacks from Christadelphians, who, for some reason, don't like their followers knowing the truth about their history for some reason. So this guy, John Hutchinson, mentioned that Robert Roberts had another prediction for the return of Jesus. And he also said that apparently an entire chapter of Robert's book, Christendom Astray, had to be deleted in the 1950s because Robert's prophecies were so blatantly untrue, and the Christadelphians wanted to keep selling the book anyways. And there's nothing like trying to hide something that makes me want to read it so much more. Like, I totally get the appeal of banned books week. Knowledge is power. And as a side note, if you weren't already aware, sentences have also been removed from Elpis Israel when later editions were published, and they were removed for the same reason. What John Thomas wrote was inaccurate to the reality of the situation, and Christadelphians wanted to keep selling his books anyways. So this might be another good time to mention that this is another reason why I don't think Christadelphians should be self-regulating. If you hide things that you don't want people to know when you publish books that you own the rights to using your publishing house, then you're probably also going to hide ugly things like child abuse, criminal activity, or whatever else. And so far, that is frequently, although not always, the case. So I'm just throwing that out there, that my skepticism against Christadelphian attempts to make sure that other Christadelphians do the right thing is founded on a lot of evidence that historically that doesn't always happen. Okay, so let's go back to the prophecy. I wasn't really planning to ever read Christendom Astray, but then I found out about the deleted chapter, and I immediately was like, hell yeah, I want to read this, and I need to read it right now. So luckily for me, there is a free PDF of the original Christendom Astray available online, and it includes the deleted chapter, chapter 16, called Evidence That the End is Near. So that checks out. And for reference, this book was originally published in 1884, so the end that was near in reference was near the date of 1884, so that's 141 years ago as of this recording. So in that chapter of Robert's book, Roberts breaks down his prophetic arithmetic. He says each day in Daniel represents a year. Then that quote, adopting the year-day principle, we shall proceed to point out the evidences which show that we have now reached the utmost limits of the time of the Gentiles, and stand upon the verge of the future foretold by the prophets, unquote. So yeah, he's positive that we're in the end times. And after that, once again, he mentions that there's multiple ways of getting to this conclusion. A lot of other people agree with him, basically, so he's pretty sure he's right this time. Jesus is about to come back, basically go to war with all the countries that currently exist. And so he lists all of his biblical calculations, and on page 271, he concludes that Jesus will return in 1910. And what I love about this digital version is that directly below that prophecy, they just add in brackets, time has shown this calculation to be incorrect. I'm just like, that's perfect. That is fair. It has been shown to be incorrect. And this way of addressing that fact does maintain the integrity of the book because it kept all of the original material while still adding context, like they do on social media nowadays. So I have respect for that. They didn't hide this chapter, unlike some people. As always, you can choose to believe whatever you want, but hiding information while telling people that they have to believe it because the consequences of not believing is literally death is pretty fucking manipulative. When we talk about control and high control groups, please remember that. Like, whoever makes these decisions to edit these books must be thinking that people would leave if they knew the truth about this. Otherwise, they wouldn't hide this. So the fact that people are hiding this means that their group members aren't able to make an informed decision about whether to be a group member of this group or not. And that is very unethical. And they'll probably hate me for pointing this out, but I literally don't do anything except read Christadelphian writings and verify the truth of the matter for myself. And again, that's just one part of why this topic is something that I think has to be covered for people who've left the group. Because prophecy and current events are used as basically a threat against people who have left or are thinking about leaving. Prophecy is a very significant part of Christadelphian beliefs and culture, and it is perhaps the most aggressive part of their culture because of how it is wielded against ex-Christadelphians. It is used to instigate fear, encourage people to come back, and to stay with the group until they literally die. That fear can be hard to let go of, and it can be hard to have an answer when people are demanding an answer from you. For me, being more informed on this topic only strengthens my position to not go anywhere near an ecclesia ever again, and to be prepared if I ever wanted to have a conversation about this with someone. But also, prophecy is used against Christadelphians too. Like I said, there's two sides of this story. And I had no idea that I was being taught a censored version of Christadelphian history and potentially manipulated to believe this ever since I was literally born. I didn't know about all these false prophecies when I was a member. I didn't know that the people who made this up were already disproven, or that this way of looking at prophecy backwards through the lens of history basically means it's optimistic guesswork. So this does actually impact Christadelphians too, which is also sad because you took away their ability to make an informed choice about this. And you're manipulating a lot of people using this tool. And now that I know all of this, it's really gutsy that they push it as strongly as they do. Listen to this next quote. While I was reading this book, Christendom Astray by Robert Roberts, I loved this little bit. This is key here. Quote, "This theory is not expressly affirmed in the Word," unquote. Say what now? It's not in the Bible? Well, that's pretty alarming for a religion that claims to be based on the Bible. If the prophesied date of 1910 that Robert Roberts mentioned in this book is not proven by the Bible, which supposedly this whole religion is based on, then why should I believe it, and where on earth did it come from? Well, Roberts answers that, quote, "We rely particularly on the deductions of Dr. Thomas, who has given a great deal of attention to the subject," unquote. Of course. It always comes back to John Bad Boy Thomas. Every time. And I'd argue that this goes beyond John Thomas, all the way back to William Miller and the other people who influenced Miller, since John Thomas made his first prediction using Miller's methods. He basically started publishing Millerite prophecies under the Christadelphian branding, and it took over to the point that it was superseding the Bible. And somehow this is another horrifying but not even shocking reveal. It's like in Scooby-Doo when they pull the mask off the villain at the end. Yeah, I'm surprised it was this sweet old lady haunting her motel guest. She seemed so nice, and she offered the Scooby Gang cookies. But I'm also just so used to the reveal at the end of the show that it's not even actually that surprising anymore at the same time. It's kind of basically always the same culprit. And unfortunately, Roberts did not live to see yet another failed prophecy because he died in 1898. And despite his belief that Jesus was going to return during his lifetime, certainly, definitely, and he believed that God heard his prayers, God wouldn't let him down, Jesus did not return. And even though he thought that even if Jesus didn't return during his lifetime, he would return shortly after he died, that also didn't happen. And he spent almost his entire life dedicated to this faith. Like literally, remember, being chased by mobs, hiking to meeting with his wife, spending all of his time and money on this religion. And what did he get? What did he get? Literally nothing back. He's buried in a grave on a continent he never lived on, away from his family and his home because of this. And he never got his retirement that he had really counted on God giving him. But after Robert Roberts died and wasn't able to continue the Millerite, Christadelphian tradition of making a new prediction for the return of Christ, the other brothers in Christ have since been happy to take on the burden of choosing new dates for the prophesied return of Christ every decade or so. So that's not the end of their prophecies either. John Hutchinson also mentioned that a Christadelphian named Walter Marks in 1921 predicted that Christ will return in 1934 after Russia, Germany, and France would attack the British, and the King of England would apparently literally offer his crown to Jesus Christ. After that, Christ would use British ships to transport Jews from around the world to Palestine. And that very much did not happen. So that Christadelphian prophecy of 1934 failed. And just to tie up another loose end as we move past the 1930s, we recall that Roberts had predicted that after Jesus returned in the 1890s, Jesus would be setting up his kingdom and spending time with the people who Roberts called the Daniel class in the 1940s at the start of the millennium. So, spoiler alert, that also did not happen. In the Christadelphian magazine in December 1892, they wrote that, quote, "The year when the world is considered 6,000 years old is AD 1910. If the papal power lease of 1260 end in 1866-8, and 1290 end in 1896-8, and the 1335 in 1943, or 33 years after the ending of the 6,000 years according to his reckoning," unquote. And yes, this is kind of confusing gibberish, but this is biblical algebra. And basically the prophecy predicted major prophecy fulfillments in 1866, 1896, and 1943. And none of those proved true. But what is also kind of funny is that just 5 years later, in October 1897 edition of the Christadelphian magazine again, they stated that the Earth would be 6,000 years old in 1940. So I guess they were 30 years off the first time, because in 1892, they said that year was 1910. But either way, the Earth is not 6,000 years old, and Jesus did not return in the 1940s. And that failed prediction kind of closed the door on the Thomas and Roberts era of Bible prophecy, since that was about as far out as their projected prophecies were. So the next big era of Christadelphian prophecy related to the establishment of Israel as a nation. Christadelphians have always been fixated on Jews and Israel because of their passion for the Bible. So after World War II, when the nation of Israel was suddenly established in Palestine in 1848, this was seen as a sign from God and a core part of a prophecy. I am not an expert on Palestinian history. The whole event could probably be a whole semester of a university class, so I'm just going to leave the topic at that sentence. The main takeaway for this episode is that this was such a massive change in the favor of the Jewish people that the Christadelphians were sure that it was a sign from God. God may not answer your prayers to save an innocent child from cancer, but he did answer your prayers to displace native Palestinians from their homes. You know, God works in mysterious ways, I guess. So Christadelphians generally decided that because there was once again a nation of Israel, that must mean that the kingdom of God would be set up in the next 40 years. And Rob actually mentioned this prophecy in the previous episode we did on prophecy. And the May 1988 edition of the Christadelphian magazine focused on Israel and the new key date of 1948. Once again, Christadelphians made a promise that it was happening this time for realsies. Okay? Quote, "This generation shall not pass away till all be fulfilled," unquote. You hear that? All the Christadelphians alive in the 1980s would live to see the return of Christ and the beginning of the millennium that Christ would start. And no, not the millennium that we think of when we say Y2K. This is the Jesus ruling the earth for 1,000 years millennium. It's different. And not just some of it would be fulfilled. All will be fulfilled. But once again, it didn't happen. And another generation who was promised everlasting life during their lifetime instead spent their life waiting for the prophecy to be fulfilled until passing away without ever seeing all the things they were promised by their spiritual leaders. They may as well be waiting for Godot because it yielded the same results. But what's interesting to me is that 1948 is literally over 100 years after John Thomas's failed predictions of 1844 being the time for the return of Christ. And some of his followers apparently decide, oh, like John Thomas must have been right after all, because God restored his people to Israel. Ignoring the fact that there's no Jesus. But, it's just close enough. It's close enough, right? But even that sentiment of, it's close enough, shows the cognitive dissonance, because John Thomas and subsequently Robert Roberts had already predicted multiple dates, and they had been disproven multiple times. So it was pretty clear that they were wrong. But because people and followers wanted to believe it, they kept waiting anyways. And as soon as there was an event they could interpret as positive, and somewhat related to their goal, they would just immediately give themselves credit. Basically, no amount of failures would ever be interpreted as a failure, and any success, no matter how unrelated and how off the mark from the actual predictions, would be counted as a win. So then there's basically no way off that hamster wheel of waiting. And this is common in cult-like groups. I remember while watching that Netflix special Keep Sweet, they said that growing up, they believed that this old guy who they called the prophet wasn't going to die. And I think if he did die, he was supposed to come back to life. But then, he was old and he did die and he stayed dead, which was the problem for their prophecy. But instead of admitting the prediction was wrong, a new leader came in and had to convince everybody that he was the prophet now. And, that he convinced people to buy into his promises and what he was saying that they should believe. And it may sound kind of crazy that you could just change your prophecy like that. But cults can endure despite being proven wrong in their claims. And it only sounds crazy because it's not what you believe. And again, Robert Roberts was an example of this too. He believed what he was taught when he was young. And he remained with the group for his entire life, despite countless moments where his beliefs were proven wrong. It's recorded by Islip Collier and Robert Roberts' A Study of the Life and Character that Roberts, quote, admitted that the progress of events, although much slower than he had hoped, has been in the direction he anticipated, unquote. So basically, yes, every prediction had let him down, but it was close enough. That quote just captures so perfectly that he was disappointed that the dates passed without the promises he believed would be fulfilled happening. But he was willing to settle for anything that he could use to bolster his beliefs, the good enough view. After a lifetime of waiting, he toned down his expectations while still choosing to find scraps of evidence that he could say support his beliefs because they were generally aligned, instead of looking critically at the evidence to decide if there was enough evidence to justify his beliefs. And I think I've seen this attitude of, it's close enough, permeate among modern Christadelphians too, because people aren't really selling their possessions and only thinking of the return of Christ. They're not waiting on hilltops dressed in white robes anymore. No. Nowadays, they're planning vacations, probably to Bible school, and putting money in retirement accounts, hopefully, and generally going about their lives while the brothers scan the news for anything they can claim supports their beliefs and is in the general direction they anticipated. And it's sad to see, but this is very common for people in cult-like groups to get stuck in this gray area. It seems that they'll, in general, ignore the contradictions or use cognitive dissonance to explain the problem away. Honestly, how else can someone believe it when we've just reviewed not only that they've been wrong every time, but also that they literally built the foundation for their predictions on a failed method that went down in history for how badly it went wrong. So to wrap up going through prophetic dates, I've also asked ex-Christadelphians about the dates of other prophecies that they remember, and some have already shared dates that they were told on the podcast. Heather mentioned how 2001 was suddenly the end times because of 9/11, and Christadelphians in America were looking for the end. Meanwhile, Steve had been told Jesus was going to return in 1971, and so he had been anxious to be baptized to save himself in time for that event, which didn't happen. Rob also shared the prediction of 40 years after 1948, so 1988 would be a big year in the previous episode on prophecy. I've also heard these years, 1967, 1980, 1989 through 1992, 2000, because it was the millennium, and yes, that's Y2K this time, 2007, 2012, 2014, and it keeps going to the present day. It's funny to see these because I remember spending New Year's, and I'm pretty sure it was Y2K with Christadelphians, and I was like, we don't usually celebrate with these people. And growing up, I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure it's because my parents thought the end times were going to start at midnight. And fortunately we were fine, but it's weird to think about my parents waiting for the end times with us as children. And that was the only Millerite-esque day of waiting that I remember. And just like every other time, it didn't happen. There is a prominent underlying message to this episode. So by now, we've reviewed over a dozen historical prophecies of the Christadelphians for Christ's return and found that none of them have held up. On top of that, in some cases, evidence showing that they were wrong has been hidden, or the expectations have been adjusted to try to encourage belief regardless, which is extremely manipulative. I think by now I've reviewed the history enough that we're aware that they keep making predictions that fail. Okay, got it. But a core problem with Christadelphian prophecy is that there's no scenario in which they will believe that the prophecy was false or wrong. That's the bigger problem. Why does it not seem to matter that they're wrong? Why are they hanging on to good enough? If the prophecy fails, but they still believe that every outcome is in their favor, then you can't reason with them logically because the prediction is not able to be seen in falsifiable terms where the prediction either came true or did not come true. Somehow everything else is black and white except for that. If they want their predictions to be taken seriously, then it needs to be falsifiable, or it can be tested, and the end result will either be found to support it or contradict it, instead of saying, close enough, like Robert Roberts did. That's not how that works. And that's why this episode could potentially be the most triggering episode of the podcast, because basically every 2 minutes I say, hey, this isn't true, while making jokes that they probably don't like. And every time I say that something is wrong, it can potentially trigger cognitive dissonance, and they may feel so uncomfortable when faced with evidence against their beliefs that they'll find a way to explain everything away. They'll probably just attack me and be like, Zinnia doesn't know what she's talking about, or come up with a roundabout explanation that makes them feel better about their beliefs. And in fact, listening to this could even make their faith stronger, like a supervillain that just keeps surviving every attack because it triggers those defensive tendencies. You think you defeated it with logic, but you are wrong because this is not a normal situation. And instead, they might redirect the attacks to the wrong place and come back stronger. They also keep making prophecies. I don't know if this one has been officially announced from Christadelphian platforms, but I saw online that some Christadelphians were claiming that August 2nd, 2027, is the actual date of the return of Christ. Okay, this is for realsies. This is it. But do we want to predict whether this one is going to come true? Because if we're gambling, I know where I would put my money in that bet. But this tendency to always spin the circumstances into a positive, even when it doesn't make sense, makes it frustrating to try to reason with someone who cannot connect the dots. I'm guessing that aliens could come down to Earth, start beaming people up, taking them to another planet, and some Christadelphians will still be like, the prophecy is unfolding exactly how we predicted it. Jesus will be here at any minute. Because anything bad is close enough to their predictions, and they'll just look in the Bible for anything vaguely resembling a historical event and then retroactively say that it was predicted in the Bible. Please tell me now, where are aliens in the Bible? Because I want to be prepared if they're coming. Okay, tell me your prophecy. And another example is Clifford the Big Red Dog could come to life, start chasing mailmen all over the country, just destroy everything in his path like Godzilla, because this big red dog, for those of you who don't know from the book, is the size of a 2-story house. And Christadelphians would still meet together every Sunday and be like, this is the birth pangs of Christ's return. Like, every event, no matter how random, is interpreted as a sign of the times, no matter what it is or how relevant it is or not. Like, they would probably be able to find a Bible verse that points to Clifford the Big Red Dog as Godzilla being a sign of a fulfilled Bible prophecy. And they'll be like, the word slobber is in the Bible, so, that's why. I'm pretty sure there's something about dogs. I don't know. I'm not a Bible scholar, so I'm sure they'll find something. But of course, they will find that Bible verse after it happens, because that's how Christadelphian prophecy works. It's generally just looking at the Bible after reading your morning news. But again, a prophecy is supposed to be looking towards the future and is promising you something in return for the actions you take during your life based on that information, right? And I get that it's hard when your mind is conditioned to see things related to religion one way. So here's another example to try to reframe it in a way that's easier to relate to in a non-religious way of thinking. Okay, so most adult churchgoers will donate money to their church, ecclesia, whatever, every week for the collection. Imagine if you're giving that money to an investor instead, no longer a church. And the investor makes a prediction and says, I'm putting it into an account and I predict it's going to give you a 7% return over the next 10 years. At the end of 10 years, you lost the money. His prediction of a return didn't come true. You got nothing back. No return on investment. And since we are comparing this to the church, he actually moved the money to his own account. Okay. Would you give the same investor more money? Would you keep putting more money into his account, hoping that next time he's right and you get something out of this deal? Let's say you do. Again, another 10 years. He's lost all your money. You never see a return on your investment, and now it's his money. Should you give it another 10 years? Okay, let's go to 30 years. Now your friends have a down payment on a house, and you have $0, despite every week doing what you were told to do to get a return for 30 years. And you could leave and feel like you lost something. Or you could stay and hold on to that hope that you'll be proven wrong someday. It feels very optimistic to stay. It may feel less uncomfortable than, the awkward conversation of saying, like, you really shouldn't be an investor in this hypothetical scenario. But if you look at it purely based on facts, there are some red flags for that hypothetical person. And for people outside of that situation, like, you'd be wondering, like, why they're staying and how they can be so blind, potentially. Would you really keep trusting this guy with your future when he's shown that he's not trustworthy? Like, what if he was hiding all of his investment receipts from you? Would that matter if he was hiding information from you? Does it matter if that person is taking your money for their own interest in the short term and is also not following through on what they promised you in the long term? Like, it seems like a crazy marketing scheme to me to be like, oh, you'll see a return on investment when you're dead. You promised every generation since John Thomas that they would see a return on investment during their lifetime. So no. What do you mean when I'm dead? That was not the original promise. It was supposed to be during my lifetime, during my generation, and then the next generation, and then the next generation, and then the next one. And honestly, even Jesus made that promise, so there's a problem here. And I mean, everyone who has believed that has died. And now it's after they die all of a sudden that they're going to get it. Like, oh, sure. This is not looking promising just based on the return on investment for all of those previous generations. But again, these mechanisms we've mentioned before come into play. The cognitive dissonance, the sunk cost fallacy. People are essentially saying, yeah, I'm going to keep giving this investor my money in the hopes that I might see a payoff before or after I die. But maybe he has a family friend. Maybe everyone in the family gives him money. So you feel weird with your family, if you don't too. There are other factors at play in that type of situation, so I get it. But I want to share this information on this podcast so that people can try to unpack things around this topic and get some real perspective on this. I mean, this is scary stuff. And if it's true, man, I'm being left behind. It sucks. But it's also the underlying incentive to be a member of the group. If I do what they tell me to do, then I should basically get a golden ticket into the kingdom of God when Jesus returns. But If Jesus doesn't return, then there's no kingdom. And if there's no kingdom, what's the incentive to be a Christadelphian? If that was true, then they would lose members. They would lose money. Things would go downhill for the organization in general. So their followers need to believe that Jesus is going to return to keep the group going. But I mean, this playbook is getting really old. I remember during my time as a member that the general vibe was more, oh, it could be any day, so just be prepared, every second of every day. And like, just remember that you're in the last days. Things are only going to get worse until Christ returns. And then they would just talk about the terrible things that happened somewhere in the world to encourage you to believe that everything is getting worse. And bonus, they also want you to believe that things will never get better. Like, for a group that claims to peddle hope, that's pretty fucking hopeless in my opinion. Like, you believe that nothing will ever get better until Jesus comes. But then Jesus never comes. And you're content to just sit there watching things fall apart and watching people suffer without wanting to get involved? Like, that's not hopeful. That's just being complicit. At best, that's being passive most of the time. And so far, your hope has led to a lot of people living hopeless lives of waiting and dying disappointed. And I get it. A lot of things are bad. Sometimes life sucks. But it turns out that every generation has believed that things are getting worse. So unfortunately, that pessimism is nothing different. That's nothing new. It feels true that things are getting worse, and maybe it is. But even if it was, is the solution to just not do anything? To just stop caring about other people? Like, for Christadelphians in general, that has traditionally meant, yeah, I am willing to watch people suffer and die because it means that I'm closer to getting what I want. If I try to help others, I'm interfering with God's plan because they have this belief that things have to be bad. Things have to be getting worse. That's almost, now what they want. And that's great if you want to divide people into us versus them. It's probably very effective to watch them numbly watch as people suffer. But if you are connected to your community, you'll want to help others and you'll care about others. And like, for me, I would rather someone say that their life was better because I existed and I did something that helped them, rather than for just me, myself, to walk alone into eternal life, knowing that I've spent my whole life only thinking about my own salvation and letting people suffer around me when I could have helped them. And when you start seeing it that way, it's more understandable why this belief in the end times can kind of bring out the worst in some Christadelphians. I've said before that good people can get swept up in bad theology and into cults. And with prophecy being something that is considered so important and central to their purpose, this means that some good people will get into it and bear the burden in order to get this glorious prize of immortality. Unfortunately, this means that they may get really excited by people's misery in the news because it's great news for them. It comes up a lot when tragedy strikes, that like an ex-Christadelphian might make a cynical remark. They're like, oh, the Christadelphians must be so excited about that terrible thing that happened because now this tragedy happened. The more important thing for them is that this means their individual salvation must be coming soon. Like, yay! But it's awful. It's like, oh, sorry, your best friend drowned in that tragic accident. But good news is Jesus is coming. Ugh, like the reality is the world hasn't ended and the kingdom hasn't come. Instead, you have this group of people on the sidelines refusing to take any action, like voting, trying to create a better world. And to outsiders, they're basically cheering on everything terrible in the world. And it's just not a good look. And yes, I know not every Christadelphian does this. I don't think I did. But I know that I heard this messaging consistently throughout my life from the brothers at the platform. So it is part of the wider culture, and it's reinforced by people at the top. I don't think that attitude is really healthy for anybody, and it doesn't reflect well on the group as a whole to have such a callous view of the rest of humanity because they're so distracted, only thinking of themselves and this kingdom that they have prophesied will be coming. I know it's getting a little heavy here, So let's take a break from a word from our sponsors. Today, I'm going to read a transcribed message from our sponsor. Hello, humans. This is the ruler of planet Clarion speaking. First, we wanted to apologize for scaring the Americans with our drones. Maybe we didn't need so many drones after all. Our bad. Anyways, today I am telepathically sharing my message with this podcast host because we have big news for you Earthlings. We have rescheduled the rapture to take you guys away from Earth after heavier than usual call volume to planet Clarion since last year. You guys saw our drones and kept saying, beam me up. So we thought, why not loop back around to Earth? It's been almost 70 years since we told the Earthlings that it was going to flood and they believed us. I mean, since they saved themselves by believing in us. But don't get your hopes up yet because it is not yet the right time. Like all divine beings, we need you to be patient with us. We'll definitely beam you up for real this time. But first you need to decode the secret date of when we're coming. It'll be after the sun bypasses the three-headed dinosaurs being ridden by a hot virgin as she lights a field on fire before the tomatoes rot on the vine. And there will be a blast of saxophone music for the vibes. So, okay, that's the message we wanted you to have. So you'll just need to figure out the date and time strictly based on that very detailed, very precise information. We're confident that you special Earthlings will understand our very clear message and it won't be misunderstood or reinterpreted by any different generation after this. Actually, you know what? Some of you are so smart that you already figured it out. And, we will be ready to take willing Earthlings back to planet Clarion in the Roche galaxy on August 2nd, 2027. And yes, we use the same calendar that you use on Earth, despite that not making sense since we're not in the same galaxy as your planetary sun. Don't worry about the logic, though. Just worry about having enough hope in us to convince us to come back for you before we maybe destroy your planet. Don't worry about that part, though, either. Just worry about yourself, because our religion believes that only you and your life matters. So go tell everyone who you want to take with you about this limited time offer to join us on planet Clarion. We know that you have lots of experience with prophecy, so we know you'll be ready and excited to watch the world around you burn while you stand frozen in place waiting for someone to save you. We're looking forward to having you on our planet sometime between tomorrow and 2,000 years from now. I mean on August 2nd, 2027. Sorry we can't tell you more, but aliens work in mysterious ways. Goodbye, humans, and please don't shoot down our drones next time. One other thing that may be relevant here is that this belief in the end times can actually give Christadelphians a motivation to participate in behaviors to encourage the apocalypse. And maybe you're thinking, no way, Christadelphians wouldn't do something crazy like try to start a war. But let me dive into the history again because I couldn't fucking believe it either. So please, join me on another terrifying journey into the history of the Christadelphians. And that time, John Thomas tried to start a war. This next story comes straight from Elpis Israel again, the very first Christadelphian book written by the very first Christadelphian. In the preface to Elpis Israel, we learn that John Thomas tried to send a copy of Elpis Israel to the Tsar of Russia at the time, Emperor Nicholas I, because he wanted Russia to invade the West and start a war. And yes, somehow Christadelphians can't vote because that would be political and against God's will. But somehow advising world leaders to start a literal war is okay. I mean, tell me you've got an ego and you're a hypocrite without telling me you're an ego and a hypocrite. But also, how could you brand your religion as, pacifists and people who shouldn't be enlisted in military service if that was the case? Oh, war is wrong except for when you start it? Also, I thought everything was in God's hands. So shouldn't God be the one influencing this czar to invade other countries or not? Either John Thomas doesn't think that God is omnipotent, or he believes that he is God's prophet and an arm of God, which Christadelphians deny. So which is it? I mean, it seems unlikely that God was using him as a tool if what he said was going to happen didn't happen. So that's problematic. And John Thomas was reading biblical prophecy, and he decided he believed that the Tsar was the prince of Rosh, Mosh, and Tubal. So he sent him a letter addressing him as such. John Thomas addressed him as this prince of Rosh, then wrote, quote, I address you, Tsar, by the title which the God of heaven hath bestowed upon you in the writings of his holy prophets, who in their day made known his secrets before autocrats and kings of great renown. The title is equivalent to autocrat of all the Russias, unquote. And if you haven't already, listen to episode 20, Prophecy with Rob and Steve, because Steve is a biblical studies scholar, and he has a more advanced understanding of the Hebrew through his formal training, and discusses this exact claim that John Thomas made. And unfortunately, Steve does not believe that Rosh means Russia, and certainly not autocrat of Russia, just because they start with an R. And I'm guessing that's why John Thomas and Christadelphian since have believed that Russia is going to fulfill a biblical prophecy. And yeah, that precedent for that belief began in Elpis Israel in the 1840s. To keep going, in Elpis Israel, John Thomas included a transcript of the letter he wrote to the Tsar. And he wrote in this letter, quote, Tsar, I write to you respectfully to invite your attention to what Israel's prophets recorded concerning the mission of your sacred Russia, and to request your acceptance of a work styled Elpis Israel. The book will explain to you the applicability of the above title to your dynasty. Fear not then, O Tsar, to unloose your hosts against the West. Europe is weak, and her debility is your strength, unquote. He also added that this, quote, is the earnest and daily prayer to heaven, unquote, of John Thomas. And yes, he was writing about himself in third person. The other thing to know for context is that this guy, Emperor Nicholas I, did not like the Jews. So I don't think this letter would have interested him one bit. He apparently forced Jewish men to serve in the Russian army and was censoring Jewish books during his reign. So I don't think he would have been like, oh, let me help the Jews become like this sovereign nation. That was very much not on his agenda. But John Thomas sent him this book like, have fun storming the continent. But what's also included in the edition I found online is something that's even more relevant to today's episode, and it was added as a note in the third edition of Elpis Israel. Quote, in 4 or 5 years after, Nicholas was suddenly removed, not being the right man for future developments, unquote. Oh, really? You advised the leader of Russia to invade Europe and then just go, oopsie daisies, wrong guy, when things didn't work out? Like, are you kidding me? That's not a good look. And it's still, like, when you learn that, you're like, oh, this is crazy. That despite all of this, people are still listening to this guy and believing his religion. Like this guy who almost intentionally started a fucking war. Because let me just go back to it real quick. Because when you go through what he wrote, he says Russia is his sword to punish the Latins and to recompense the Greeks. Arise and draw thy sword upon the Turk and the Papist. He says to go and invade Turkey, invade Austria, invade Naples, Sardinia, Portugal, Spain, France, Germany, Denmark, England, France, Austria. He's mentioning all of these countries in Europe. And I was just like, oh my god, he was trying to start a fucking war. Like, I'm not even kidding. And it's all right there in his first book. And people go up to the platform at the Christadelphian meeting halls and quote this guy. And they all just skip over that part. Wow. And let's explore how this played out for a minute. This letter that was included in the preface of Elpis Israel was dated for 1851. And that was when John Thomas was trying to encourage Russia to invade basically all of Europe. And I mean, there was eventually a war, right? So did he at least figure out that Russia was going to invade, but like maybe he got the year and the leader wrong? Well, one thing that is interesting is that Nicholas I did actually instigate the Crimean War in June 1853. So, yay, prophecy fulfilled by the Tsar of Russia, right? Russia must be fulfilling the prophecy. Well, no. In the end, Russia's invasion ended in defeat in 1856. So despite the Tsar's readiness to go to war, seemingly fulfilling Christadelphian prophecy at the time, it was ultimately unsuccessful. So let's try again. World War I didn't start until 1914. So that was about 65 years after Elpis Israel was published. So the date wasn't even close. And I didn't realize this, but Austria-Hungary actually invaded Russia in 1914 at the beginning of World War I. So in comparing what happened to his prediction Elpis Israel, John Thomas had claimed that Austria was, quote, death-stricken, unquote, and was thereby weak and vulnerable to attack. But he got that backwards, like, whoops, because Russia was in fact invaded by the country it was supposed to invade, according to John Thomas's prediction, Elpis Israel. Oh my gosh, like I said, we're going to have some fun because we're debunking more of John Thomas's predictions and hopefully freeing ourselves from his beliefs in the process when seeing how much of it was just not true. Another thing I want to mention here is that the doctor's stance on encouraging war is pretty ironic, considering that once the American Civil War started, the doctor wrote in his magazine, The Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come, in September 1861, that, quote, a Christian engaging in or encouraging war, whether offensive or defensive, does so in open violation of every precept of Christianity, unquote. But, often the founders of high control religions are exempt from their own rules. So that appears to be the case with Dr. Thomas here when we have recorded in his own book his attempts at starting a war, let alone just encouraging it. And this next section is one of the things I want to mention today, and probably the thing that will get me the most flack, which is saying something considering everything I've discussed in this episode and on this podcast. So while researching this episode, I looked at a few definitions online. The first is apocalypticism, which is a religious belief that the end of the world is imminent, even within one's own lifetime. We've seen throughout this episode that early Christadelphians believed that the end times were going to be in their lifetime, and that claim has since been made for generations. So it appears that Christadelphians believe in apocalypticism. Another definition I looked at was millenarianism. God. Millenarianism. I can't stop saying it like Nemo in Finding Nemo, trying to pronounce the anemone. Anemone. And sorry, but millenarianism is a belief by a group and a transformation of society, after which all things will be changed. If you do a quick Google search on that term, with the name Christadelphian, it quickly pops up that they are millenarianism in some of the results. And this totally makes sense for those of us who are members, and we learned that everything about this world will, quote, pass away, and that the world will be changed. According to Christadelphian teachings, Jesus will set up a new kingdom, God will come down to earth, and there will be a new version of earth where suddenly there's no death, no illness, no crying, whatever, anything bad, gone. So I would say, yeah, that's very different than our current earth, where we are crying a lot. Okay, so why am I telling you the definitions of apocalypticism and millenarianism, which I can barely pronounce? Because I want you to be familiar with those when I read this next part. I was on Wikipedia, and I saw that the definition of a doomsday cult is a group that believes in apocalypticism and millenarianism. So, according to that definition, the Christadelphians do fit the description of a doomsday cult. And I know that they don't wear their rapture clothes every Sunday and tell countries to start wars. I mean, okay, maybe historically speaking, they do that last part. But, they're not that flashy. Somehow they've managed to pull off being a boring doomsday cult, which, isn't really great either. And it is a really scandalous sounding term. But honestly, having relatives send you video links and text messages and Facebook posts telling you that you need to be informed because the end of the world is coming does kind of seem like something a member of a doomsday cult would send to you. And seeing as that happens to me and other people like me and podcast guests that have been on this show, there's a lot of overlap between that. And to be clear, you can choose to believe whatever you want. It doesn't impact me if you tell your neighbor that an alien is telepathically communicating with you at the end of the world is in 2027. I mean, they'll probably tell your other neighbors that you're in a doomsday cult, but if you choose to tell everyone you know that you believe the end of the world is coming, then their reactions are just a consequence of your actions. And really, at the end of the day, what's the difference between waiting on a hilltop or waiting in an ecclesia for the return of Christ or something to change the world? One is just waiting for one day, whereas the other is waiting every Sunday for the rest of your life. And what's the difference between waiting for a flood because you got a telepathic warning or for another end of times disaster that someone says they got from a book from 2,000 years ago? And what's the difference between waiting for Jesus and waiting for a UFO to appear? Like, you're just waiting to watch this prophesied doom come for humanity and hoping that your actions will save you because someone told you that they would. And if I asked, I assume people would say, oh, like, I'm waiting because I have faith that this is true. And I could ask you, like, why do you have faith in these apocalyptic beliefs? And I'm sure some people would say, because they believe that prophecies have been fulfilled. But I mean, we just spent an hour looking at this, and they haven't come true. They haven't been fulfilled. And even to take that line of reasoning one step further, if someone believes in their faith because prophecy was fulfilled, then shouldn't the opposite be true, that they will not believe in it if the evidence proves that it was false? But again, that's not really the reality of what happens. Instead, they really simply decide to believe it and can't let the beliefs go. And that's where it gets more into the cult part of the doomsday cult. So now I just want to go back to the origins of cognitive dissonance for a minute. Remember, I explained that idea earlier in this episode, and I said how cognitive dissonance is likely the psychological mechanism for how people continue to hold beliefs that were proven to be untrue, and aliens helped us figure this out? Okay, thanks. Well, the concept itself is insightful, but the scientists involved also theorized that there are several conditions that make it more likely that someone will use cognitive dissonance to continue to hold their beliefs. So while I read these conditions, like, maybe ask yourself if these conditions could apply to a good Christadelphian, because that's what I'm going to do. Okay, so let's go through this list to see what conditions cause it to be more likely that someone will be susceptible to cognitive dissonance. First, the person must hold a deep conviction in the belief, and their beliefs must relate to their actions and behavior. For Christadelphian, yeah. A good Christadelphian only believes Christadelphian teaching, so they have a deep conviction in that. They call it the truth, and it does relate to their actions and behavior. They're going to marry a Christadelphian, raise Christadelphian children, go to Christadelphian services at least once a week, follow the traditions and cultural norms of their ecclesia, even if that includes not celebrating Christmas for some reason. 2, the person must have committed themselves to their beliefs. And I say that's definitely a yes for anyone who had a public baptism in front of all of their relatives like I did. 3rd, the belief must be specific and relate to the real world enough that it can be disproven. So yes, with all those Christadelphian prophecies, they predicted that Jesus was going to return to the physical earth. It does relate to the real world. And that his followers were going to be whisked away, and that he was going to be like fighting world leaders and stuff. And like every global headline was going to be like, Jesus is back, baby. And despite setting date after date and expecting these things to happen, it did not happen. So yes, those have been disproven. They have not been whisked away. 4, undeniable evidence must be presented to the person holding the belief that the belief is not true. So yeah, they never got whisked away. So basically every day they wake up, it's reiterated that if the date had passed, it was untrue. And I mean, John Thomas said Jesus would return over and over, and Jesus never returned. So that would do it. And I mean, that's just keeping it simple. I mean, if you need more evidence that he didn't return, just consider the fact that they keep making new prophecies since then, which they wouldn't have made if he had returned. And I mean, the fact that Jesus isn't setting up like a big kingdom in Jerusalem right now. Okay, and 5, the last one. And this was the most surprising one to me. The believer has to have social support in their beliefs. And I think initially this was surprising to me because belief is so personal. Technically, it only involves you and I guess God, if that's what you believe in. So why is there a social aspect to whether people experience cognitive dissonance? But the more I thought about it, the more it actually makes sense. Social acceptance is a huge psychological driver, and it's related to our sense of survival. We want to belong to a group. The group can also help explain away your doubt. They can encourage you to stay when you want to leave. I mean, that happened to me. It's also a big reason why many people stay as long as they do, because they have those attachments. And if they don't have those attachments, they may not have as much incentive to conform and keep those social ties. And looking back on these 5 contributors to cognitive dissonance, it starts to make more sense why people are willing to ignore the evidence and find a mental workaround so that they can keep their social ties and their beliefs. These psychological phenomena are a natural human process and a way we are wired when we are in groups. When you consider that most Christadelphians are raised in these social groups and are asked to hold deep beliefs, to publicly commit to their religion, to believe in these things that are preached to them, and they have these strong social ties, then they are being set up to have all of the conditions for cognitive dissonance to occur. It's certainly not a personal failure at that point. So I can understand a little bit why they want to believe and how they're able to keep believing something that's untrue, at least with all of the prophecies that we've seen today. But again, I will say that faith in spite of evidence isn't really faith anymore, and it's certainly not the truth. And what's funny about working on this episode right now is that a lot of people, at least here in America, are currently feeling stressed out. And I've seen media of people expressing that they're stressed and it feels like the world is ending. And a Christadelphian has tunnel vision where they might respond, well, it is. I believe God wants our world as we know it to end and he's going to replace it with something else. But I recently saw an Instagram video that I think was really helpful because the woman in the video replies to, herself as someone else, saying that in a very different way than what we're used to hearing. Because when they say, oh, it feels like the end of the world, she says, what are you feeling? The world is ending is not a feeling. And so she goes in deeper in the video and explains the real feelings under that belief that the world is ending. And underneath, there's anxiety, there's anger, there's frustration, there's powerlessness that they're feeling, and they're struggling to handle it because they can't control what's happening in their environment. And that makes a lot of sense. And in the end, she explains that really at the core, what they think they're feeling is really grief. And I think that that's really helpful for us to remember for perspective, because we're all human. We all have human emotions. And some of us may struggle more with navigating our emotions. And yes, some people may go so far to escape their feelings that they end up in a doomsday cult because, think about it, they will help their members alleviate fear and pain and grief, all of those feelings that come with being alive. They'll give you an environment that is controlled when you feel powerless and out of control in your broader environment. I mean, they have a nice script to recite to you and give you a sense of control. There's stability, there's consistency, there's purpose. And maybe those feelings are easier to live with than grief and powerlessness. Honestly, emotions suck sometimes. It's painful. And again, to me, based on this evidence, I would say that logically it doesn't make sense to have Christadelphian beliefs if you are informed of this. Like, if your favorite sports team lost every single game for over 100 years, would you place a bet that they're going to win the following year? If your date says they're going to meet you at a restaurant and they ghost you over 100 times, would you think they're going to show up the next time? And if your preacher says that Jesus is definitely going to return this time after having been wrong since an event literally called the Great Disappointment of 1844, are you still going to believe him when he claims that he really double-checked this time and now he's sure he's got the date right? Like, logically, you're like, no, that doesn't make sense. But when you look at it from this emotional perspective, being a member of the group may be helping meet their emotional needs, and especially if they struggle with emotions. So that's why, even though like the lack of logic drives me crazy, I don't pressure anyone to listen to this podcast. I don't try to convince my family to leave. It's their decision as adults to believe what they want to believe. And honestly, on the second point, I see how it does serve some practical function for some people in their lives. Not only is it where their friends and family are, but it may help keep them from feeling overwhelmed and scared just day to day. And I get it. But for those of us who have left, we may be tired of hearing about the prophecy and being told that we need to repent because the end times are coming. So, next time they come at you with their latest doomsday prophecy, just remember that John Thomas has never been right in his prophecies, and just let them wait it out again, because that's all we can do. So let's just do a quick review of what we learned about the history of Christadelphian prophecy in this episode, because there is a lot of evidence stacking up from history against any evidence for Christadelphian Bible prophecy. When we looked at the history, we found that the roots of Christadelphian Bible prophecy were founded on the same prophetic methods as William Miller, despite Miller being proven wrong in his predictions multiple times. And despite that, John Thomas modeled his predictions after Miller. Then John Thomas, the person credited with having the truth, made multiple failed prophecies himself during his lifetime. Robert Roberts then followed in his footsteps, making and being disappointed by his own prophecies. Then many of those failed prophecies were hidden from Christadelphians by removing the evidence of failed prophecies from Christadelphian books that were published at Christadelphian publishing organizations. Christadelphian prophetic predictions have since spread to ecclesias worldwide as they've continued to make prophecies to the present day of this apocalyptic period on earth, followed by everything being changed. And unfortunately, those beliefs are what categorize doomsday cults. And then we chatted about that time John Thomas tried to start a war to kick off the apocalypse, which I hope people don't try again. And then, of course, we looked at why people may believe this, from cognitive dissonance, where they're basically too invested in the group to admit that something isn't right, to struggling with their own emotions and finding comfort in the environment that Christadelphian ecclesias offer. And as always, this has been so interesting to research. And after looking into it for myself based on that evidence, I really don't believe that there's enough evidence to justify faith in this belief system based on prophecy. And unfortunately, I don't have an alternative for you. I don't have the answers. I unfortunately don't know what the future holds. But I do know that we can learn a lot from looking at history. Because as the saying goes, history repeats itself. And it looks like the Christadelphians are setting themselves up over and over again for a great disappointment. Thanks for listening, everyone. That's all for today's episode on the history of Christadelphian prophecy. I hope it was informative and gave you a few laughs. As always, I appreciate you listening and exploring the history of the Christadelphians with me from an ex-Christadelphian point of view. Take care, and we'll see you next time. Thank you to everyone who has helped make this episode of the podcast possible. Today's episode was edited by me, Zinnia. I'd also like to thank Al Kroons for creating our intro music and the ex-Christadelphians that submitted audio for the intro music. If you'd like to join our community, you can find us at the group for ex-Christadelphians on Facebook. You can also follow our social media on Facebook and Instagram at Life After Leaving Podcast. If you'd like to come on the podcast, reach out to me at lifeafterleavingpodcast@gmail.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please consider leaving a rating and review or sharing this podcast with a friend. That's all for today. Thanks, and see you next time.